Hello and welcome to Future Squared. Stephen Hawking once said that intelligence is the ability to adapt to change, so let's adapt. My name is Steve Goveski, and each week I'll bring you conversations with preeminent thought leaders from a variety of fields to help you think in a multidisciplinary way, keep goals in your professional and personal life, and better navigate what is fast becoming a brave new world. Future Squared is brought to you by Collective Campus, an innovation accelerator that works with organizations to unlock their people's latent potential to create more impact for humanity and lead more fulfilling lives. If you need help driving your organization's innovation strategy, visit collectivecampus.io. And without further ado,
come with me if you want to live.
Welcome back to Future Squared for episode number 290 with Mick Wall. Mick Wall is an author, journalist, film, television, and radio writer-producer who's worked inside the music industry for 4 decades. He is widely considered to be to music journalism what Keith Richards is to guitar. Since cutting his teeth for rock magazine Sounds in 1976, Wall went on to work for the likes of Kerrang, Rolling Stone, Playboy, Mojo, and Classic Rock magazine. He has also hosted various TV and radio programs and co-produced several TV documentaries for the BBC, including When Albums Ruled the World. Mostly though, Wall is now best known as a biographer and author. He has published numerous bestsellers, which draw from his time on the road with bands such as Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin, Ozzy Osbourne, Guns N' Roses, Metallica, Motorhead, Iron Maiden, and many more. His latest book is a fully revised edition of When Giants Walked the Earth, 50 Years of Led Zeppelin, released to mark, incidentally, the 50th anniversary of the formation of Led Zeppelin, and this their most widely acclaimed definitive biography. We explored a number of topics in this conversation, including Wall's early years as a music journalist and the struggles he had to overcome to make it, tales from the trenches on why sheer talent usually isn't enough to succeed, the conditions for creativity, particularly when it comes to writing iconic rock albums, fascinating anecdotes from Wall's time on the road with bands like Guns N' Roses, and of course, his new and revised version of his Led Zeppelin biography, When Giants Ruled the Earth. There were a number of other topics I wanted to explore with Wall, but we ultimately ran out of time. However, I plan on having him back on the show in the near future to close the loop on his days on the road with notorious rock bands, as well as deep dive into his views on the music industry today and how he approaches his writing. Nonetheless, this episode is jam-packed with not only hilarious anecdotes from life on the road, but also lots of life lessons. So with that, I bring you the one, the only, Mick Wall. Welcome to the show, Mick.
Good to be here.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. It's actually quite a trip for me because the first time I heard your name, I was literally in the 8th grade. It was 1997, and I had taken over the school's stereo system for the lunch hour. And little did I know that the Use Your Illusion album that I had been given that day had a little track on it called Get in the Ring, in which Axl Rose reserved some none-too-savory comments for you about his anatomy and you. Long story short, I was promptly suspended, so I'm not sure who to blame, Axl Rose or yourself, Mick.
I think you can lay that one at Axl's door.
Fair enough, fair enough. I should probably blame myself for not actually listening to the track before playing it, but that's another story. Mick, today I really wanted to, explore a number of things. I mean, obviously you've got the revised version of When Giants Walk the Earth. That's just come out, celebrating 50 years of Led Zeppelin. We'll definitely get to that. But, I mean, you're a music industry veteran. You've been in the space for 4 years. You've worked with everyone from Bon Jovi to Metallica to Def Leppard to, Zeppelin and Sabbath and, of course, Guns N' Roses. So I wanted to, I suppose, take a trip back into 1976 when a young 18-year-old speed dealer living in squalor in a London flat decided to respond to an ad for a journalist in Sounds magazine.
That's right, yeah. It was a friend of mine that pointed it out to me. I didn't actually read any music papers at that point. I'd read some earlier, but at this stage, living away from home for the first time, I was 17 when I left home, but I lived in a house full of old hippies that were in their mid-20s, and I just didn't read music papers anymore. I was getting my education from these guys who had all these records by these artists I'd never heard of. I mean, you have to remember there's no internet in those days. There's no social media. In the UK, we had exactly 3 TV channels and one pop music radio channel. So you learned everything from people you knew and concerts. So I didn't I didn't read music papers at all. And then 2 things happened. A friend of mine pointed out there was an ad in Sounds magazine, which was a magazine I'd never even bought or knew anything about. And another guy I met was actually a writer for Sounds magazine, and he'd just come back from America, where he'd spent a couple of weeks hanging out with Leonard Skinner and all kinds of adventures. Well, I'll have a look at this, and because I was always into writing, I used to write lyrics and poetry and stories, and the ad said the crucial words were "no experience necessary," and that was it. I sent in a test piece. It got rejected. I sent some more. I mean, this went on for quite a long time, and then I thought I clearly wasn't cut out for this, so I sent one last thing. And at that point, they sent me off to review a band just in a little pub in London, an unknown band. And baby steps from there. That was the start.
I guess a story of persistence there, and getting rejected initially, and persisting. And then a few short years later, you had a few bumps in the road, and eventually you flirted with getting into PR. And you were about to begin a degree in English as a mature student at the London University when in 1983, I believe it was, in a 2-week trip to LA forced you to reconsider. What happened on that trip to LA, Mick?
I'm sitting in a hotel room with a photographer and some other friends, and just talking about coming towards the end of the trip, what we were doing when we got back to London. And it was the summertime, and I was thinking, because college and university over here starts in September, and I was saying, well, I've got this, in September I'm going to start doing this English degree. And I was 25 by then, which was considered quite old. But and they said, well, what's your plan? Once you get the degree, what are you going to do? And I said, well, I'd really like to be a writer, And they kind of looked at me and said, isn't that what you are already? And of course, I didn't mean a writer for a music magazine. I meant a writer of books and novels and all kinds of things. But it kind of switched a thing in my mind, and I thought, well, yeah, I've been a published writer since I was 19, and maybe I am going about this the wrong way. So I thought I'd just delay it a year. I put it back a year, see how things went. Because at that particular moment, my career as a writer was starting to take off in England. I was getting a lot of really interesting things to do, and within a few months, I'd have my own TV show, and there was all kinds of stuff going on. And I suddenly thought, well, yeah, maybe this university thing can just wait 1 year, and that was 35 years ago.
Yeah, how much of that was
still waiting to go?
Yeah. How much of that was a result of persistence and talent, and how much of it was right time, right place, getting involved with Kerrang magazine just before the heavy metal tidal wave really took over the world?
I think both. It was right time, right place, but that was after I'd been right time, wrong place for about 6 years.
Yeah.
So yes, there's that aspect, absolutely. On the other hand, you have to do the work. You have to get good at what you do. And, what happened at Kerrang was they got a new editor. And I'd done literally 2 pieces. I was flirting with writing for some other magazines at the time, and I still had this English degree idea in my head. And he took me for a drink and just said, look, we don't have a big staff, but if you really want to throw in your lot with us, sky's the limit. We'll make you our number 1 guy, and see where it goes. So again, my 5-minute plan was, okay, well, this sounds good. Probably won't be doing it in a year, but that's cool. And it really did just take off, and it was the 80s. CDs were on the horizon, which completely transformed the record industry, because it suddenly became exceedingly wealthy. And hard rock and heavy metal, which was not my only music of choice. I'd written about all kinds of things before that, but Kerrang, of course, specialized in that. And I liked it because not necessarily I liked the music, but that wasn't my reason. My reason was these guys had amazing stories. You know, I've always been more interested. My father was a musician, and him and his band would, after shows, come back to our house and sit around all night drinking and smoking and telling stories. And that really was my whole thing. I loved to hear these stories. And pop musicians who I'd worked a lot with at that point, often their careers were, you know, Adam Ant, you know, his career was gone in 2 years. You know, Culture Club, gone in 2 years, essentially. You hang out with someone like Ozzy Osbourne or Lemmy or Jimmy Page or Phil Lynott from Thin Lizzy or Bon Scott, who I knew. These guys have stories. You know, these guys have walked through the fire and come out the other side, and they are funny as hell. You know, they will have you laughing till the tears run down your face. And so I ran with the Kerrang thing and spent, I think, in the end, about 8 or 9 years traveling all over the world, settled in Los Angeles for a couple of years. But you're right, it was at that boom time where that music really took over the world, but at a time when record companies had so much money, they were quite happy to, you know, I'd go on the road for 3 weeks here and 2 weeks there. I'd fly to New York for 2 days and stay for 6 weeks. And because also in the UK, hard rock and heavy metal was so unfashionable. It didn't get played on the radio. It didn't get shown on TV. The only place, and yet it was selling huge amounts of records, the only place you could connect with that scene, read about these people, get really in-depth insights into them and interviews and pictures, was Kerrang magazine. There was no other magazine like it at that time. So record companies were very happy to lavish money on us, giving us this incredible access and incredible opportunities to you know, because these bands are popular all over the world. That's the other thing that's so great about that music, is that you're not just stuck in one little country being number one in the charts and no one else in the world knows who you are. They're big all over. So
there was a lot of global travel opportunities. Yeah, absolutely. And for a young guy that wasn't married or anything like that, it was just a fantastic ride. Kept waiting for it to end. I couldn't understand why it kept going. Yeah, and I mean, on the bands that have stories, I know when it did end, or at least when that era of debauchery ended, you tell a story in your book, Get Your Rocks Off, which is more or less your own autobiography of that period of time from the late 70s through to the early 90s, of a band called Little Angels, who you thought were actually quite good, but they were just too young and they didn't have stories, and so you just weren't interested.
It's true. They're an English band. They're from up north in England, and I'd reviewed some of their records. They were good records. They could have been. They were kind of like a junior Def Leppard. You know, they were poised to become bigger. And as part of that, they came to America and did a short tour. And part of that was spending some time in LA, which is where I was based at the time. And so I was assigned to do a story on them. And they were lovely guys. I bumped into the singer not so long ago. Really nice young guys, but quite a bit younger than me at that time. And I mean, just, you know, I did my job. I did my little interviews and I spent the day with them. But they had other things going on, and they really expected that I'd be with them for a few days. And I didn't. I bailed. I remember the night they were doing a show, I bailed because I was going out for dinner with David Coverdale. The next day I didn't show up because I think I was hanging out with Slash. You know, it was just those days, and they took it very badly. They took it as, and it really wasn't that way. It was just, I'd just gotten too far over the rainbow at that point that I didn't know what they were talking about. I didn't get that they would feel at all upset by anything. I thought they were, I'd given them my 2 days. What more did they need?
Yeah.
So it just shows, your own perspective changes. You lose touch with your roots because I wasn't interested in keeping in touch with my roots. I was living in LA and having too good a time.
Yeah, and I can totally understand why, having read Get Your Rocks Off. But a couple of things I wanted to explore there. I mean, one thing that you said was when you did get the gig with Kerrang, part of it was luck, but a part of it was doing the work. And it was Nicky Sixx recently posted something, I think it was on Instagram, where he posted a photo of him with a 76 Les Paul, and this was taken in 1978, and he said he bought it in the Trading Post with money he saved moving irrigation pipe at 5 a.m. 7 days a week on farms outside of Jerome, Idaho. So a lot of people, when they see someone make it, whether it's as a music journalist, whether it's as a musician, they think, wow, he's so lucky, or they're so lucky. But there's oftentimes years of blood, sweat and tears and perseverance and rejection that goes into it that people often don't see.
No, absolutely, and it's because of that. That's what eventually makes the later work interesting, if you're lucky. I mean, in my case, I'd done everything from working on a building site to being a waiter in a restaurant, a dishwasher, a furniture mover. I worked on what was called the tree gang, which was working for local government on street trees, digging them up, planting them, climbing them, trimming them. I'd done all kinds of mucky jobs, and I'd done it for a long time. Kitchen porter. At the time I started writing for Kerrang, I was working at Heathrow Airport, scrubbing these enormous pots, like half the size of half a man.
Wow.
Which was the food. It was the mass-produced food that they would cook for all the airlines. And when it was done, you had these enormous, huge pots. You had to lean your whole body in to clean them, and that was a 24/7 job. You'd turn up at 8 a.m. and there'd be this mountain of filthy, disgusting pots. And when you left at 4 p.m., there'd still be the same amount because the next shift started, and it took about drudgery. I mean, it was not easy. It was horrible, but I did tons of horrible jobs, and that humor that you develop to get through those scenes goes into the writing later on. I mean, a lot of my stuff back then, the reason people enjoyed it was funny. And it was funny because it was all about the ridiculousness of life. And a lot of these bands are the same. I mean, Ozzy worked in a slaughterhouse. So many people, I mean, the jobs that Lemmy did as a kid, oh my God, and he would tell you these stories. And it goes into the personality. It's part of the grit that makes the pearl. Yeah,
definitely. And I mean, a lot of the Black Sabbath fans listening will know the Tony Iommi story and how he worked in a metal foundry, I believe it was, where he lost the tips of his fingers cutting sheet metal. And obviously that's attributed to part of the sound that Black Sabbath has these days, or at least his guitar tone.
Yeah, no, absolutely, because he invented these little fingertips for himself because he couldn't touch the strings anymore. It was from his right hand, and being a left-handed player, it was the right hand that bent all the notes. And so he melted down an old washing up liquid bottle and welded them onto his fingers with tiny strips of leather, and it meant he couldn't feel the notes he was playing in that real sense of being able to feel what you're doing. So he had to down-tune the guitar and just kind of improvise, and from that came that incredibly doom-laden Black Sabbath guitar sound. So, yeah, I mean, necessity is the mother of invention. All these things contribute to the person you are and whatever it is you're able to achieve.
And do you think there's something to be said then about people who come up with, say, less than comfortable upbringing or less than comfortable surrounds? I mean, you look at there's Tony Iommi, but then a few years later, obviously, well, quite a few years later, Rick Allen losing his arm in a terrible accident. Rick Allen, obviously the drummer of Def Leppard, for those in the audience who don't know who he is. But then just redesigning how he played drums, so he'd play the snare drum with his foot. I mean, that just speaks volumes about the desire, the persistence, the passion that these people have, where they're just unwavering in the desire to make something of themselves. Whereas in that situation, you would think, oh, it's so easy to quit. You know, you've lost your arm. How am I ever going to play drums for a world-class rock band? But he found a way.
Absolutely. I mean, I always say some of the, I'm thinking right now of two particular people in my mind, but some of the most talented, most gifted, most extraordinarily brilliant musicians that I've worked with over the years didn't make it. And the reason they didn't make it was they were so gifted. They truly believed one day opportunity would knock on their door, and a guy with a big checkbook would walk in, and their life would be wonderful. And it just doesn't happen like that. You know, I mean, 90% of it is getting your ass out the door and just turning up. And no matter how uncomfortable it might be or how rotten you might be. I mean, when I was first published as a writer, I mean, I couldn't write. I mean, I used to sit there for hours with a dictionary trying to think of big words to put into my reviews. Until an editor said to me, "Do you write with a dictionary?" And I was like, no. He said, "Well, stop, because it's just gibberish. You're just coming up with this rubbish, and find something to say. You know, you're not saying anything. You're just filling the page with words." So you have to turn up. You have to. I mean, it's tricky because, you know, you see all these reality shows, these poor buggers going, "I will work. I promise I will work really hard," and blah blah blah. Don't promise, just do it. Yep. You know, just the one. You know, I don't know how you ended up where you are today, but I'm sure you didn't win a competition. You know, and they just gave you the job. I mean, you start from nowhere, and you take a few steps, and it's quite discouraging quite often. But if you just keep going, and you've got anything going for you at all, sooner or later something will happen. Just depends whether you've got the fortitude really to not just keep going, but to seize those opportunities. When I was an editor, the Classic Rock magazine, the writers that did well for me were the ones that always said yes. So I might call you and say, "So, Steve, what do you know about Black Sabbath?" And the ones that got the gig were the ones that went, "Everything. I know everything." Do you think you could yes before I've even asked the question? Yeah. And that's how I was. I remember being asked, did I know about this? Do I know about that? I knew nothing, but I just would, you know, of course I do. Yeah, you leave that with me. I'll take care of it. And quite often, not do the best job going, but I would do a job, and it would get paid. And then you're on to the next thing. So you have to not just want it, you've got to have something in your personality, which, I mean, one of the first things Kerrang asked me to do was go and see a group called Marillion, and I'd heard one of their records, and I just thought it was just the most tremendous drivel, you know, but it was a job, and I went, yeah, I'll do that, and I went on the road with them for 5 days, and I came back loving their music, and a few years later I ended up writing their official biography. I'm still friends with them today, you know, but had I been honest and said, "Oh, I don't really like that, and I don't really want to do that," or "I don't know," you know, you can't do that. You've really got to be a Jack the Lad. You know, you've really got to be someone that a chancer a little bit and just say, "Yeah, I'll do it. I can do it. I'll do it. I will be there." I think that's the same with musicians.
Yeah, very much about doing the work even when you don't feel like it. Because if you're in a band touring, say 200 nights a year, you know, there's going to be countless nights where you just don't feel like it. You're probably feeling a bit groggy from the day before. You probably miss home, miss your family, all sorts of reasons. But hey, you've got an audience of 5,000 to 10,000 people, potentially, maybe more, who have each paid over $100. You've got to put on a show regardless of how you feel.
Absolutely. Particularly in the early days where there might not be anybody there at all. You know, the bands that make it are the ones that go out there as if they're about to go on the opera house and planning show to thousands of adoring fans, when you're actually standing in a bar in the outback somewhere playing to 4 people and a dog. Because I still get this now. I get young writers saying, "Oh, well, it's okay for you. You're Mick Wall. You can just get the right pass and do whatever you want to do." And I go, "Do you think? What do you think? I was just born to this?" What, they just went, "Oh, one day you'll be a famous writer. Here, have a pass." You know.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of entitlement.
I'm just like you. I just had to hustle.
Yeah, and there's a lot of entitlement in today's sort of youth that I'm observing anyways, whereby people, I guess it's the everybody gets a trophy generation in many respects. And something you said there about the two musicians you knew who had this innate talent, but it sounds like what they had were these fixed mindsets where they just expected that because they had this talent, things would just fall in their lap, versus someone who doesn't really rate themselves that highly and knows that because of that, they need to put in the work, but they have a growth mindset where it's all about doing the work so you can get better over time and just outworking everybody else. And everybody I speak to, regardless of whether or not they're a music journalist, an entrepreneur, a musician, a comedian, anybody successful, they always say the number one thing was doing the work and just being persistent, showing up day after day after day.
Absolutely. And I think in music a lot and in sports, the people that really make it are often the people that had no plan B. You know, they didn't have well-off parents that they could rely on. It was do or die, and they had to sweat and toil and fail repeatedly and still keep going because they had no choice. That end up finally, breaking on through.
Exactly. So, look, I wanted to go back to Kerrang, joining the magazine in 1983, but fast forward, say, 4 years, Mick, to 87. By this point, you'd been in the music business for about 10 years. You'd worked with Zeppelin and Sabbath, and you were the go-to guy for bands like Metallica, Def Leppard, and Ozzy as well. And by this point, 87, a little band called Guns N' Roses came onto the scene, and you were more or less their go-to guy. You were part of their inner circle.
Well, the thing that interested me about them was, they were a really good band. That's obviously
fantastic.
number one.
Yeah.
But when you see that in those days, if you saw them in a little club or something, it was a no-brainer. It was absolutely a no-brainer. They just were as good as they became. They were already that long before they'd made it. But the thing that I found really interesting about them at that particular time was the fact that they were about the most un-80s band I had met. I like all young people, I just always felt I'd kind of missed the boat a bit, and at the golden age of rock and roll and writing about that whole scene was the 60s and the 70s. And now here, when people wrote about the Stones and Dylan and Hendrix and Zeppelin, and now here I was in the 80s, and what have I got? Bon Jovi, it just Poison, it just felt like I kind of missed the big deal. And suddenly here's Guns N' Roses, and you have to remember as well, sponsorship had just come into music in the 80s. AIDS was a huge cloud hovering over everything. You've got Reagan in America, Thatcher in Britain. It was like an anti-70s decade. And so even people like David Coverdale, who'd been in Deep Purple in the 70s, or Ozzy, who'd been in Sabbath, even these guys now in interviews don't really want to talk about anything other than they went to the gym today and they loved their fans and yada, yada, yada. And you go on the road and find, of course, they were just as debauched as ever, but they didn't want to talk about it. They didn't want it to be, they wanted to lie to their audience, about who they were, because that's Bon Jovi, I've always been faithful to my wife. Yeah, okay.
Of course.
Suddenly Guns N' Roses are just letting it all hang out. I felt like I'd jumped in a time machine and gone back to 1970 or something, because it was all drugs, it was all girls, it was all about getting high, getting laid, and they wanted to make it. Of course they did. Slash came from a well-off background, but the others were poor. The others really had no plan B, particularly Axl. He was a guy completely out on the ends of the earth there, clinging on for life. And I just liked them. They were real. They weren't at all pretentious. They didn't get their hair teased. They smoked cigarettes, and they were funny as hell. And I really did think, you know, how long they'll be around, because they're definitely going to flame out, you know.
Yeah.
And yet somehow, I also thought they were wrong for the period, because the radio wouldn't play their records. You know, their very first single was riddled with swear words. I mean, these the new normal, you know. But back then, it was like self-harm. You know, why would you do that when you know radio stations won't play you, because no internet, no phones. You know, that was your only way of becoming well known. Mm. And yet they did it. They just did not give us stuff. Yeah. And that was very, very exciting back then. It always is, but back then, particularly so, because it was like finding a rare dinosaur egg. You know, you thought these beasts were extinct, and here was a young one. It was like, oh my God. So I loved that about them. Mm. And then when they actually connected, they did it in such a big way, because they were so different, because they were exciting, in the same way that a few years later Nirvana would have a very similar effect, because they were so not what was going on at the time, that they suddenly became what was going on. And so, yeah, I mean, you know, you've got Izzy, long before they were famous, you've got Izzy straddling, dealing drugs to people like Steven Tyler and Joe Perry of Aerosmith. Mm-hmm. You've got Slash and Steven, the drummer, turning tricks on Hollywood Boulevard to make money. You've got Axl, who at that point was the sanest person in the group by a long way. He was quietly spoken. He was together. He had his own little kind of enclave away from the rest of the others in that house, and he had a lock on the door. And although he was as crazy as batshit, just like the others were, he was the sane head. He was the brains of the operation, and he was the one that steered the ship. And I think a lot of that gets forgotten, because obviously in the intervening years, his public image now is the opposite, as this kind of mad professor, that this recluse, you know, this guy that you can't have a reasonable conversation with. But he wasn't like that in those days, and he's still not. He's still the brains of the operation. He's a incredibly intelligent but undereducated guy who was massively abused as a young child, sexually, physically violent, psychologically, you know, a very, very damaged young man. And to top everything else, his first record, Appetite for Destruction, sells over 40 million albums. Now, at that time, that was more records. To put it in perspective, that was more records than Bob Dylan had sold in his entire career. You know, I think, again, people don't understand quite how enormous they became. And so this lost Indiana boy, who is almost a street person in LA when he first arrives, somehow pulls it together with a band that, on paper, everything you shouldn't be in the 80s. But because of his sheer force of will, he pulls it together, and they become the biggest band on earth, the last of the truly enormous rock bands that connected straight back to Jim Morrison and the Doors, straight back to the Stones, and they were still dangerous, straight back to Hendrix and the Beatles and Dylan, straight back to that age when rock spoke truth to power, when rock didn't give a monkey whether you played its records or not. It just was undeniable. And so you had all that feeling from the get-go with them, except it was funnier because they were all like spinning off in 5 different directions, even at that point. So by the time they become really, really famous, they are now distant points on the map from each other. And it says, it kind of explains a lot about what happened to them. You know, people blame Axl for the fact that they didn't last beyond what was essentially just their second album, Use Your Illusion.
Yeah.
Although it was 2 double albums released simultaneously, it was their second attempt to make an album. And after that, no more since. And people say, well, that's Axl because he's crazy. No, they are all crazy. And they were almost destined for that to happen. And I think that's the kind of perspective we need to see them in now, as opposed to, it was a missed opportunity for them to make more records. Nah, it was brilliant while it lasted, and it always will be.
Yeah, and I mean, Appetite for Destruction to this day stacks up 31 years later, which speaks volumes about how timeless it is. But you spoke about sex, the drugs, the smoking, everything else. They just did not give a rat's ass. Yet they wrote and released what is one of the biggest selling albums of all time. Yet today, the internet is awash with a lot of talk about, make sure you get your 8 hours sleep, get your good fats, eat your kale, eat your avocado, have your brain supplements, all this sort of stuff. How do you reconcile what these bands were capable of, particularly a band like Guns N' Roses at their peak, despite all the sex, drugs, and just reckless, debauched lifestyles that they lived?
Well, the thing about people that live balanced lives and have 8 hours sleep and take all the right supplements is the music they make is pure vanilla.
Yeah.
The best records, any artist, Beatles, Dylan, Stones, Zeppelin, Guns N' Roses, the best music any of these guys made was when they were young and reckless and crazy. And as far as they were concerned, we use this word drugs. That was never the word that was used back in the day. It was, do you want some coke? Would you like some weed? Oh, you're really frazzled. Here, have a line of smack. That'll chill you out. They were like different clubs in a golf bag. It was they all had a reason and a purpose, and mostly it was creativity. The reason Jimi Hendrix took so much LSD was because he was trying to make his music become the most far-out music in the world. The reason jazz artists, go all the way, the reason mankind, going back thousands of years, has experimented with sacramental substances which turn you into a shaman or a witch doctor or have some kind of life journey, is because we are a questing species, and musicians that make original music that purports to push the envelope, purports to take things a step further, will do anything to get there. And all these drugs were used by these people because they wanted to live on the edge, because they did not want to be Mr. 8 hours a night sleep and get up and eat your oatmeal and have your supplements. That's not who they wanted to be. Yeah. The world was full of people like that. They wanted to be the first men in space. They wanted to explore new worlds, even if it meant not leaving their bedroom. And so the two go hand in hand. Some of the greatest music Miles Davis ever made was when he was a heroin addict. Hendrix, it was acid. The Beatles, it was acid plus all the other drugs. Heroin again. Stones. Keith Richards. The Stones haven't made a decent record since the early 70s, when they were all of them out of their brains 24/7.
Yeah.
So it's not that the drugs made, but the desire to be different and the desire to be extraordinary and make this extraordinarily rebellious, antisocial music, it kind of goes hand in hand.
Yeah, and I think it was David Bowie who said he couldn't remember recording, I think it was Station to Station, because at the time he was subsisting purely on a diet of red peppers, cocaine, and milk. And countless other artists.
Well, yeah,
no, go for it.
And that was his greatest period, from Ziggy through Station to Station, and then Low, and all those albums that were sort of post-drugs.
Yeah.
You can't, you and I could take the same drugs. It doesn't mean we're going to come up with Station to Station. No. So you have to bear that in mind. But the point is, they kept pushing themselves. Bowie could have made Ziggy Stardust parts 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, just the way as the Stones ended up doing with their record. And he'd have still been a huge star, but he wanted to be different. He dared to try something new. And part of that was staying up for days on end and dreaming these crazy dreams. And that's what the cocaine helped him do. Of course, it killed so many of them in the end. Like the Michael Monroe song, Dead, Jail, or Rock and Roll. You know, it's one of the things that makes group is so exciting and why they live large in our imagination, because we know they weren't kidding. We know they really were much, much worse at these things than people even realize.
Yeah, and we see that play out in different disciplines too, where chaos really precedes creativity. Even in the entrepreneurial domain, there's a building at MIT in Boston called Building 20, which was due to be knocked down, but ultimately, this is where a lot of people from different disciplines came together. There was no curriculum. They just threw stuff against the wall and they just saw what would stick. And out of that building came the first video game ever back in the 60s called Space War, computer hacking, radar technology. Yeah. All this stuff came out of that building. And it's just because there were no constraints. There was no formality around it. It was like, let's just get different people together and let's just see what happens at the intersection of all these different disciplines. And some amazing stuff happened because you just did not have any rules in place and you just let people be.
Steve Jobs and his partner Wozniacki. You know, these guys were tripping on rock music and looking to far out vistas, staring at their gatefold album sleeves from Yes, at the same time as they were inventing the future with computers and the internet and everything that we now take for granted. I mean, the U.S. government, other governments, the U.S. government have been conspicuous with their own experiments with not just what we consider now conventional drugs, but all sorts of mind-altering, psychic sharpening techniques, let's put it that way, to see if they can achieve the so-called impossible. So, you know, the reason we have cars that we drive is because we're humans, and we just thought, I wonder what would be better than a horse. You know, I mean, now it's what would be better than a car. You know, I mean, we don't stop. We don't stop. And like a lot of rock stars, if we're not careful, we will end up ODing and dying. But that's the chance you take, isn't it?
That is the chance we take for progress and evolution. So, Mick, I mean, you were talking about Guns N' Roses and how they were one of these bands that came out of nowhere in the late 80s, and more or less you wrote a biography about them called Last of the Giants, but you've got another book that's just come out. I mean, it is a revised version of When Giants Walked the Earth, 50 years of Led Zeppelin. I mean, this marks obviously not only 50 years of Led Zeppelin, but 10 years since the original biography came out. What can readers expect to take out of this book that wasn't in the original version?
Well, for a start, there's over 40,000 words been added to the book. Not just at the end, although there's a considerable story to be told, you know, that unfolded over the 10 years since the book came out, but right from the go, from prehistory Led Zeppelin in the days of the Yardbirds. And the reason for that is that at the time I was writing the book, apart from Hammer of the Gods by Stephen Davis, which is a great book that came out in the mid-'80s, but 20 years on, was very dated, you know, post-internet, post-a-million making of the album style documentaries. A lot of the so-called revelations in Hammer of the Gods just weren't that particularly exciting. Oh, they took drugs and they had groupies. Yeah, we really know that at this point. What else can you tell me? And the other thing was with Stephen's book was he based a lot of it on one interview he did with their former tour manager, Richard Cole. And I'm not trying to do the book down. It is a great book. It's really entertaining. But it wasn't the kind of book that we've seen written about the Beatles or Dylan or Mozart or Miles Davis or Picasso or, you know, any truly great artist. You need a book that tells all that juicy stuff, but it also tells you, gives you that third dimension and tells you really about that world, where it came from, what it was really all about. And also to get past the kind of cheesy aspects of, oh, Jimmy Page was into black magic. No, Jimmy Page is a very serious student, lifelong student of what we would call the occult, or he would call esoteric religions. And a lot of that, all of that, fed into the decision-making behind Led Zeppelin, the music, the artwork, the performance, the whole philosophy and thinking of that project, both good and bad, because when you perform rituals, it's not that one is good or one is bad, it's that they all are about affecting outcomes, and it just depends what outcome you want. And in Jimmy Page's case, that changed as his own fame became more monstrous and his own drug addiction became more lethal. And as the band went, the typical story of, the guy that flies too close to the sun, Icarus, you come crashing to the earth. So that was my aim, but trying to persuade people to take it that seriously and really go into those sorts of details with me was very hard back in 2006 when I first started writing and researching the book. I'd known Jimmy for over 20 years at that point. I had Robert, John Paul. I'd met John Bonham. I knew Peter Grant. I was working with Peter on his autobiography when he died. I knew Jason Bonham. He was a friend. I knew a lot of the people, but a lot of them ran scared and didn't want to be interviewed for the book, including Jason. And once the book came out, I was amazed. I was really touched because so many of those people got in touch and said they've now read the book and really regretted not being part of it because, in the words of Phil Carson, who ran Atlantic Records in the UK in the 70s and was Zeppelin's go-to guy, that was their label. In his words, he said, "You nailed it. You totally nailed Jimmy Page. You got him 100% right. You got the story right. It's extraordinary. If you ever do anything else with this, let me know because I'd love to be involved." So that happened with a number of occasions. And so what you have in the book is you have a revised version which corrects certain mistakes, but mainly goes back, because they were typographical things often, a name wrong here. But what you really have is an opportunity to go back and add this extra material. So in the case of the Yardbirds, none of them would speak to me first time around. This time, both the surviving members spoke to me for the book. Phil Carson spoke to me for the book. And Phil didn't just run their show in the 70s. He managed both Robert and Jimmy in the 80s. Phil was involved in the O2 show when they got back together in 2007. Paul Rogers is now in the book, who was a singer in The Firm with Jimmy. Chris Squire, who was in an aborted group with Jimmy after Led Zeppelin, wanted to be interviewed for the book before he died. Jason Bonham gives an extraordinary set of interviews, which are now in the book, which go right back to, obviously, when he was a boy, right up to his performances with them in the 80s and up to the O2 in London, and several others. And because they'd all read the original book, they knew there was no room for bullshit, that it was straight down to the nitty-gritty, let's get real. And they did, and it blew my mind. And, I can't now look at the original book in the same way because these extra 40,000 words have turned this into a truly extraordinary story now. Very complete, takes you right up to today. And the fact that it was 10 years ago exactly that the book came out and 50 years exactly since Led Zeppelin formed, From the publisher's point of view, that was just too good an excuse not to do something.
Yeah.
But I didn't want to just do a cheesy, here's an extra chapter.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want to do that. So actually, you've got an extra 40,000 words is about half the size of a normal sized book.
Mm.
The Led Zeppelin book is now 220,000 words long. It's the size of 2 books. And I promise you, there's not a word wasted.
Yeah, well, I just wrote a book for Wiley, and that's only 70,000 words. So at 220,000 words, we're well over 3 times the size of my book. So definitely well worth checking out. One thing I wanted to inquire about was Peter Grant, Led Zeppelin's legendary manager. How instrumental was he to the success of the band?
Well, without Peter, there wouldn't have been a Led Zeppelin.
Mm-hmm.
Co-managing he understood Jimmy's talent. He understood that Jimmy was just at the right moment where he wanted to make a statement of his own. Peter understood that Jimmy was 26. It was now or never for Jimmy, that Jimmy really wanted to do something extraordinary. The Yardbirds have been huge in America. Peter also saw it as an opportunity for him to make a big career for himself. And so Led Zeppelin was completely the Jimmy and Peter show. If you look at their records, Peter's still named as executive producer on all of them, which is something no other manager's ever had. Mm-hmm. And because of his incredible... People talk about how big he was and fearsome, which is all true. But he was a sharp business brain. He had incredible acumen. And he did something that the managers of the Stones and the Beatles and everybody else had never done. He inverted the triangle in the 70s, so that by the time Zeppelin embarked on their first US shows at the beginning of 69, in those days the promoters took 90% of the profits and the artists got 10%, because from the promoters' point of view, they were taking all the risk, they were putting up the facilities, they were doing the marketing and the posters and yada, yada, yada. And Peter Grant just swapped it round and said, no, actually from now on you get 10%, and we get 90%. He couldn't do it on that first tour, but Zeppelin became so big, so fast, that Peter just came out with this decision. And a lot of promoters in America balked at the idea, but being America, a lot of other very opportunistic young promoters said, yeah, we'll have a bit of that. Because they'd rather have 10% of Led Zeppelin than 90% of nothing. Yep. And suddenly, Zeppelin became the richest band in the world, richer than the Stones, richer than the Beatles, richer than anybody you could care to name. At a time when, in the 70s, they were outselling the Stones in America by a ratio of 2 to 1. In fact, by 1970, they were already bigger than the Beatles in America. So Grant, we were talking about right time, right place. Grant was had the right time and right place to make that decision, but only after he'd spent 7 years already in America, doing 8 American tours with the Yardbirds. Only after, the business had reached a certain tipping point where, in Zeppelin's case, there were no singles. In Zeppelin's case, there was nothing to hit them on the head with and say, well, we made you big because we sold your record to that radio station and they played it, and you... No. Zeppelin made themselves big. So if you want to put on one of our shows, you take 10% and we take 90%, or you can get Peter's big boot up your bottom. So he utterly changed the business, because once that precedent had been set, of course, all the other major acts now want the same deal. Having said that, we talk about longevity in terms of that timeless music they made in their first 7 years together, yep. As opposed to the lamentable situation that happened with their final 2 albums over their final 5 years. Arguably, they could have gone longer if Peter hadn't become such a mess. By the time you get to 75, Jimmy Page, John Bonham, Peter Grant, and Robert Plant, but particularly the first 3, were all horribly possessed by drugs, specifically heroin. In Robert's case, it wasn't specifically that, but he was as far out and up all night as everybody else. And, you know, maybe if they had got up and had their granola for breakfast a few mornings of the week and taken a few vitamins, you know, they might have lasted a little bit longer. But here's the thing, they didn't.
Yeah.
And for the same reason that I love Guns N' Roses, because they didn't last the course either. You know, it makes what they did, it time capsules it. It makes it perfectly brilliant. You know, if the Beatles hadn't broken up when they did, if they'd stayed together and carried on and become the new ELO, I mean, you know, I don't think we'd revere them in the same way that we do today. The fact is, they ended how they ended. In the case of Zeppelin, it was a spectacular crash to earth. And, you know, so are so many of Shakespeare's plays, and yet we still love them, don't we? Because, you know, happy endings are really overrated. Happy endings are so overrated. They ruin the whole movie, you know. Yeah. What you need is a tremendous flame out, and rock and roll is the ultimate medium for that.
Yeah, and otherwise you have what we see today with bands like Kiss playing the same set list for pretty much the last 20 years, milking it for all it's worth.
On yet another farewell tour.
Yeah, well, the last one was in, 2001, so that's a good 17 years ago. So farewell tour number 2, let's see if it's actually legitimate. One other question, just real quickly on Peter Grant. It seems like a lot of the big bands really had a dominant personality behind them by way of a manager, whether it was Rod Smallwood behind Iron Maiden or Doc McGhee behind bands like Motley Crue, obviously Bon Jovi. Is this something that you saw was a parallel between all of these great bands, that they all had a great manager, or was it not so much the case with some bands?
I think there is a running theme. Good or bad, they all have some guy in their corner willing to go the extra mile because he has a genuine connection with that group and that music, and it's nearly always someone who wasn't a famous manager before that. Their own success is tied in completely with that artist. So, for instance, in the case of Peter Grant, he also managed Bad Company and some other artists, but Zeppelin were always his number one. Brian Epstein with the Beatles, you know, he managed other artists, but for Brian it would always be the Beatles. Same with Peter Grant. Same with, Guns N' Roses, their original manager, Alan Niven, who they very foolishly got rid of because it reached a certain point where Axl was essentially wanted to be self-managed. He just couldn't take any more orders from anybody. But without Alan, they would never have got beyond the clubs. They would have been extraordinary and brilliant, but they'd have screwed up so many times that they were already in the last chance saloon when Alan came along. He essentially saved them from being dropped from the label and single-handedly persuaded them to make videos for the band and promote the band. So, yeah, they all have someone, because the music business is the Wild West. Particularly in those days where it was a cash business, a lot of criminals, mafia, very connected to the American music business. You know, if you want to, if you don't just need the sheriff, you know, you also need big bad Bart to be on your side too. And so all these guys were part sheriff and part, gang leader.
Yeah.
And they had to be to negotiate an incredible business where artists are routinely ripped off and tossed in the gutter. That's still true today. Yeah,
could not agree more on that. And look, Mick, you've given our audience a hell of a lot of time. We've gone 15 minutes over the scheduled 45. But before I let you go, I've got one last question for you. You know, you've been in the game for 4 decades now. You've authored countless books. You've hosted radio. You've done TV. You've made documentaries. You've written for Rolling Stone, Classic Rock, Mojo, all sorts of magazines. You turned 60 earlier this year, so happy birthday on that. But you are still kicking. Like you said, you just released a book with 220,000 words. I imagine you no longer make yourself a strong cup of water to stay on top of of your game these days, as you put it, get your rocks off. How do you keep churning out such high-quality content today, Mick?
No plan B. That's it in a sentence, Steve. If I don't get paid. And if I don't get paid, my children and my wife and my dogs and guinea pigs and rabbit and hamster, they all start to hate me. I do it because I love it. It's what I do. And no, there's no drugs or anything like that. For me, it's going down the gym all the time. For me, it's drinking a lot of green tea. And then after a few days, not being able to stand that anymore and going down the pub and getting hammered, It's all those things. Plus, I'm a reader. I think to be a writer, to be a good writer, you've got to be a great reader. And my poor wife, I live, where I sleep is under a mountain of books. Where I work is on top of a mountain of books. And as I sit here talking to you now, I've completely ruined the lounge because it's so untidy with piles of books. It's what I do. I love to read. And then when I'm not doing that, I really enjoy writing. It's something I still really enjoy. And unlike some of these poor musicians who don't seem to get any better at it as they get older, as far as I'm concerned, you ain't seen nothing yet.
Well, I look forward to seeing what's next. Our audience can pick up a copy of When Giants Walk the Earth, 50 Years of Led Zeppelin, the final word on the world's greatest rock band, on Amazon and wherever good books are sold. They can also find out more about you and your work at mickwall.com and hit you up on Twitter at wallmick. Is there anything else I should share with our audience?
Not really, Steve, other than I'm off to have a very nice cup of rock and roll tea and get back to writing.
Sounds very debauched. Thank you, Mick. You've been a gentleman and a scholar. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Well, listen, Steve, thanks for having me on. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Hi, guys. Steve again. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you'd like to receive a weekly email from me, complete with reflections, books I've been reading, words of wisdom, and access to blogs, ebooks, and more that I'm publishing on a regular basis, just leave your details at futuresquared.xyz/subscribe and you'll receive the very next one. If you're picking up what I'm putting down, take a minute to like, share, or subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. It goes a long way to giving the podcast the exposure it needs so I can continue bringing you guests and conversations of the highest caliber. You can catch me on Twitter at Steve Gliveski and on Instagram at TheSteveGliveski. Until next time.
Hasta la vista, baby.